Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you about data normalization and classification. This is an important thing to consider when representing and displaying your data. You need to think about how you classify the data and think about what kind of message that might send. And you need to think about data normalization, which is something we got an introduction to in lab, where you need to account for potential confounding factors. So we worked with that a little bit in lab 2. And so I'm going to give a more in-depth discussion of that. I just want to give a content warning that what I'm going to be talking about today is a very difficult and painful subject that might be triggering for some individuals, especially BIPOC individuals. I'm going to be discussing data regarding police-involved deaths in Canada. And so the video that I'm going to be showing you today is actually a lecture that I recorded back in the spring. I had hoped to show you a more updated version of this, but with the computer issues I had over the weekend, it kind of set me back a little bit. So I'm going to be showing you a slightly older version of this video. It's going to be walking through a workshop that I put together for the UBC library. And the workshop focuses on data normalization and visualization, while also emphasizing ways that GIS can be used as a tool to promote social justice issues. And so this is going to tie into lab. I apologize for the delay in posting the lab, but that will be up on Friday. Or I guess Friday night. I'll post it when as soon as Lab 3 deadline comes. So for lab, we're going to be working with an updated version of this data set. I've been working on it as a project for the last year or so, trying to update and develop a comprehensive database. And so the video that you're going to be seeing today was recorded using a previous iteration of the data. Things are still being updated, but the principles and the point of it still applies.
So the learning outcomes for today's lecture are to investigate how data normalization impacts the way we perceive patterns in a data set, look at different data classification methods, and think about how they impact the patterns we perceive in a data set, and to see an example of how open source GIS can be applied to social justice issues. So before we get into things, I just want to give a couple definitions. So data normalization, this is just the process of scaling one variable by another. So normalization allows us to highlight patterns in one variable that might be masked by the correlation with another. So perhaps the most straightforward example of data normalization would be calculating population density. So different units, say different provinces, for instance, have different populations, but you can't directly compare the populations of these different provinces because they're also different sizes. So you have to calculate population density. That's the number of people per some unit area, say the population per square kilometer. That gives a more accurate comparison of the population between two areas than just the population alone. Data classification is just methods of grouping data into a smaller number of classes so that they're easier to interpret. So you might have a data set that's got a range of numerical values and it's kind of difficult to interpret, but you can group that down into 4 or 5 classes and simplify things. So the choice of classification method can have a pretty dramatic impact on how we perceive the data set, and therefore it should be carefully considered when you're displaying your data. And then open source GIS is just a GIS tool or software that's freely available online. So open source technology is more accessible than proprietary tools like ArcPro, which makes them useful tools for individuals and organizations that might lack the resources of a large institution like UBC. So all of the analysis and visualizations that I've put together today were actually created using Python. So Python is just my favorite programming language. I've written a bunch of scripts and used it to create some charts and maps and figures to analyze the data. And so Python is freely available online. Anyone with a computer and an internet connection can download it, install it, and do whatever they want with it. There's a large community of folks that use Python for GIS, and so I prefer open source technology personally because, again, it doesn't come with the licensing fees that proprietary software like ArcPro does. So the license for ArcPro is thousands of dollars a year, and Python is free to use. So I think it's easy to see why certain technologies might be better for, say, social justice issues. So again, this is a workshop that I've designed for the library that I'm just kind of running through as a lecture. So you'll see within the website here, there's some poll questions, and those correspond to questions that I've added to the quiz on Canvas. And again, most of these are just opinion-based, but if you follow along, you'll get the correct answers for the ones that are right or wrong. So before we get into things, I just want people to think a little bit today about which country you think might have the higher frequency of police violence, Canada or the United States, or are they about equal? And I have a suspicion that most people already kind of know the answer to this question. But number two, and this one gets at the data normalization issue, which country do you think has a greater racial disparity in incidents of police violence? So there's more things that you need to take into account for this question rather than just the total number of incidents of police killing. So the main data set that we're going to be working with is a data set on police violence in Canada. This data set covers January 2000 to December 2020, and it was initially collected by the CBC. And I encourage you to take a look at the article. The data is available for anyone to download at the very bottom. Yeah, there's a link to download the data here. But this is just an analysis by the CBC. It's based on an older article that they published in 2017 that they updated in the summer of 2020. And so, according to this is from the CBC, there's no government database listing deaths at the hands of police available to the public in Canada. So the CBC created its own. And the CBC research librarians created or collected detailed information on each case, such as the ethnicity of the victim, role of mental illness and substance abuse, type of weapons used, and the police service involved to create a picture of who's dying in police encounters. So again, this data set was collected by the CBC. It's not an official account because, fortunately, police departments in Canada are not mandated to collect or disseminate this information. So rather, this data set is a collection of secondhand information, mostly in the form of press releases, news articles, etc. So some records are missing or incomplete, and the total number of incidents is, in reality, higher than what is detailed here. So for example, one of the most glaring examples that I've found is this data set doesn't include the killings of Rodney Maestas and Lawrence Wegner in January and February of the year 2000 in Saskatoon. Rodney and Lawrence are victims of what's known as a Starlight Tour. This is a heinous practice where police abduct Indigenous people during the winter and drop them off in rural areas far from their homes, leaving them to freeze to death if they can't make their way home. So I reached out to the CBC for comment on why these incidents were omitted from the data set. I even had a chat with the journalist who wrote the article, but they were unable to clarify whether this was an oversight or an intentional omission from their data set. I don't want to assume malintentions, but regardless, this highlights one of the key issues with relying on, say, a news organization to collect this type of information. It's not particularly transparent. They don't list their methods at how they collect this data. So another key issue with this, on relying on a news or to collect this type of stuff, is not updated at regular intervals. So the last time that this data set was updated prior to this past summer was 2017. They only updated it in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd, when there was a lot going on in the news media and there was a lot of incentive to publish articles about it. Once the subject fades from the news cycle, they have little incentive to continue. So they have not updated this data set since this past summer. I've added incidents that were omitted from the deadly force article and put in some effort to update the data set through December of 2020 to the best of my abilities, but it's pretty difficult to find information regarding police killings. I'm not an investigative journalist. And so especially finding the historical older records, it's quite difficult. So my updates are also incomplete. But despite the incomplete nature of this data set, it's really the best record available. And so I think it's important to look at it to understand the pervasiveness of police violence in Canada and the pervasiveness of systemic racism in policing in Canada. Systemic racism in policing is a problem across North America. This is not a problem that is just limited to the United States. So with that said, I'm going to get into looking at some aspects of this data set and just show you some different things about it before I get into talking about data normalization. So first off, look at a time series. So this is the annual totals from the year 2000 to the year 2020, and you can see in the dark red, those are the figures, the numbers in the CDC article, and in the light red, those are some missing records, which I've added, including the updated August through December of 2020. So 2020 was a tough year in a lot of regards, and one of them was a record-breaking year in Canada in terms of police killings, at least in modern recorded history. With at least 49 police-involved killings. And over the past 2 decades, there were at least 581 police killings between January 2000 and December 2020. And if you just do some simple statistics on this, you see there's a statistically significant increasing trend of approximately 1.07 police killings per year over this period. This does beg the question, is this trend real, or is this perhaps an artifact of increased awareness and access to information, pervasiveness of cell phones and social media, holding police more accountable? This data set also shows whether or not police were charged with a crime for these killings, and the overwhelming majority were not. So I use the term accountable very loosely, as there's very rarely any legal repercussions for the police, but it is perhaps possible that it's just the advent of social media and things like that, allowing these records to be more widely visible and available. We also have information on which police departments are responsible for these killings. So there are 86 total police services listed in this data set, of which 11 are responsible for 68% of all the police killings. So this table I've listed here shows all the departments or services that have killed at least 10 people in the last 2 decades. So the RCMP are responsible for 27%, or 156, of all the police killings in Canada. This makes sense given that they are the federal police service and they serve as the provincial police service in 8 of the provinces and territories. I would like to point out that the BC RCMP is far and away the deadliest police service in Canada. They've killed 80 people in the last 2 decades. Now, they serve as the municipal police force in a lot of cities like Surrey, for instance. And aside from the RCMP, large municipal police departments and provincial police services like the Ontario Police and the Quebec Provincial Police are responsible for the majority of the rest of the killing. And I've just created a web map here that you can interact with, and I encourage you to take a little bit of time to look at it on your own. Things are color-coded, so the dark red, or the red are the RCMP detachments at the provincial level. The purple are separate provincial police services, and the blue are municipal police services. And if you click on one, you can see the breakdown with the total number of killings as well as the percentage broken down by race for the different services. So you can see, for instance, that the Toronto Police Service, 33% of the people that they kill are Black individuals, which is grossly overrepresented relative to the percentage of Toronto's population that Black individuals make up. And one of the cruxes of what I'm talking about today, we can see the racial breakdown of the police killings in Canada. So you might hear someone say the statement, the majority of people killed by police in Canada are white. This statement is not false, but it is very, very misleading. So if we look at just the total number of victims by race, we can see that white people do make up the largest number of victims of police killings in Canada at almost 250. I'd also like to point out that the race of the victim is unknown in 150 incidents. So again, this highlights one of the flaws in this data set is we're relying on police reports and news articles, and they often don't give very much information. It's not in the police's best interest to release much information on these incidents. So nearly over a quarter of the incidents, we don't have the information that we really need. So I want you to think about this third question. What should we do to get a more accurate picture of the racial breakdown of police killings, right? So just looking at this chart as is, it is kind of misleading. It might, again, lead someone to think that, oh, well, you know, this statement holds true. But we really need to think about other factors, right? The demographic, the population size of these different demographic groups is not uniform within the country, so we need to take that into account. So what are the things that we should do to get a more accurate breakdown of police killings? Could display the data alongside the proportion of Canada's total population that each racial group comprises. Could divide by the total number of police killings to get a percentage. Subtract the unknown category and then divide by the total number of police killings, or divide by the total number of each racial group, or divide the total number of killings for each racial group by the total population of each racial group. So just think a little bit about what might be the best approach here. I'm going to move on to the data normalization section and give you the answer to that question. Demographic groups, as I said, are not evenly represented in the Canadian population. Canada's population is 73.4% white, but white people only account for 41.5% of police killings. And you can see that here on this chart, where the light red is the proportion of the population and the dark red is their relative proportion of police killings. Meanwhile, Canada's population is only 4.8% Indigenous and 3.4% Black. But these groups account for 17 and 8.4% of police killings, respectively. So they're grossly overrepresented relative to their proportion of the population, whereas white individuals are grossly underrepresented. And again, the victim's race is unreported in 25% of the incidents. So this means the numbers across racial groups are likely higher than reported. Beyond that, we can't say much. There's various assumptions that could be made about the distribution of the unknown killings, but I think it would be irresponsible to speak to any of that within this context. So one thing you can do is make a graph like this and display the proportion of the population relative to the proportion of killings. And this does give somewhat of a nice visual representation of the disparity, but you're relying on comparing two numbers here. So you have to look back and forth between the two. It doesn't give everything in one nice, well-rounded statistic. Excuse me. Instead, in order to adequately account for this and get everything summed up in one number, what we can do is normalize our data. So again, normalization is the process of scaling one variable by another. So for example, to find the proportion of Canada's population made up by each racial group, we can divide the population by, or the population of each racial group by the total population. This would tell us the percentage of Canada's population that each racial group makes up. So that would be normalizing. You would normalize by the sum of a data set. Normalizing by the sum of a data set is the simplest example of data normalization, right? So you're just saying what proportion of this record does this, or of this data set does this record account for? Doing the same operation to the police killing data set allows us to plot them side by side. So both of these numbers are normalized, but again, we're looking at two confounding variables next to each other. Comparing the proportion of police killings for each demographic group to their respective proportion of the population is informative. However, it's more meaningful to combine the police killings and the population into one statistic. So we can calculate the police killing rate. The police killing rate is just the number of police killings per unit of population per some unit of time. So here we're normalizing by two numbers, the total population and the period of record, to get police killing rate in the units of numbers per million per year. So Canada's total police killing rate, again, this is averaged across all demographic groups, is about 0.79 killings per million residents per year. So what that's saying is that there are 0.79 people per million residents of Canada killed by the police every year. And so there's about 33 million people in Canada. So what that's saying is there's somewhere on the order of like 22 to 23 killings per year. But again, this one simple number does not describe the whole picture because there are large racial disparities in the police killing rate between demographic groups. So we can calculate the police killing rate between demographic groups on an individual basis by substituting these numbers. So we would do, to calculate the police killing rate for Indigenous individuals, we would substitute 581 with the total number of police killings of Indigenous individuals, and we would substitute this number with just the total population of Indigenous people. And so if we do that, if we normalize the data, we account for, that is, the unequal distribution of the population within these different demographic groups, we see that the police killing rate for Indigenous and Black people in Canada is 2.82 and 1.95 per million people per year, whereas the police killing rate for white people in Canada is 0.44 per million people per year. So again, that's highlighted in this chart. You can see that there's a gross disparity in the police killing rates across demographic groups, and that Indigenous and Black individuals are much more likely to be victims of a police killing incident than a white individual. And this, again, really highlights the issue of systemic racism within Canadian policing. If systemic racism weren't an issue, we would expect all of these to be similarly distributed. We can also do statistical testing to prove this. So we could do a simple test called a chi-squared test. And I'm not going to put this on the exam or anything, so I'll leave you to read the Wikipedia article on it if you're interested. But a chi-squared test can be used to check if the observed number of police killings by racial group is statistically significantly different than what would be expected if the police killing rate was equal between racial groups. So here's an example of what can be done for the country as a whole. And so that's an error, that should say 581, but there were 581 killings in Canada between January of 2000 and December of 2020, putting the police killing rate at 0.78 per million residents per year. So if systemic racism did not exist in Canada, as the RCMP Police Commissioner Brenda Lucki claimed this summer, this rate would apply to each demographic group. And we could expect that the distribution, or we could get the expected distribution by multiplying the population of each demographic group by the average police killing rate and the record length. And then we can run a chi-square test, which will compare the expected distribution. Again, that's what we would expect if the rate was the same across groups, to the observed distribution, to see if deviations in the observed killings are beyond what would be expected by random chance. And so you can see that, again, here's the total number of killings, and we have the total populations here. And these are what we would expect if the police killing rate was uniform across the population. We would expect 426 white individuals to be killed by the police. However, we've only observed 241. Whereas with indigenous individuals, we would expect only 27, given their fairly small proportion of the total population. However, we've observed that they are grossly overrepresented in the data set. And the same circumstances apply to Black individuals. And so the chi-squared test is significant to a p-value well below 0.0001, which means that there is very strong, essentially irrefutable evidence showing that there are systemic biases, systemic racial biases in police killing. So just two other questions to get you thinking. Again, these are just opinion questions. There's no right or wrong answer here. Do you think that this pattern continue at the municipal department level or the provincial department level? So again, this is for the country as a whole. But say we took a subset and looked at just the Toronto Police Department, for instance. Do you think this pattern would continue? And also, and the answer to number 4, you can actually tease out by looking at the web map with the breakdowns by police department, if you want. So number 5, what impact do you think the missing data, that is unknown race here, has on the results of this chi-square test? Do you think it invalidates the results? Do you think the racial disparities are likely greater than indicated? Do you think the racial disparities are likely less than indicated? Or do you think it has minimal impact and the race of the unknown victims is probably distributed similarly to those of known race? So again, this is just an opinion question. I wouldn't say that there's a right or wrong answer. Really, this does highlight the issue that more work needs to be done to sort of go back and investigate these cases. The unknown records will have some impact on the chi-squared test, but regardless of how you attribute these 150 other police killings, you still, even if all 150 were white individuals, you still would not hit the expected distribution. So it highlights that regardless of the distribution of these unknown killings, there is a very strong systemic issue here.